Welcome back to ＳիվիլNet. I'm your host, Patrick Elliott, and I'm honored to host our French ambassador to Armenia, Mr. Olivier Decottignies. Thanks again for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
I want to start, I would say, the most exciting, I would even call it one of the greatest foreign affairs victory that Armenia has had in I would say, since our independence, is the recent signature of military cooperation with France. I would say even further than the significance of receiving defensive weaponry, which of course is very much appreciated given our situation. The third clause is what's really interesting to me, is the expanded open cooperation at the training level between the French military and the Armenian military. Can you tell us a little bit about this and the significance of this?
Well, it's significant because it's a way for us to assert together with our Armenian partners that defense is fully part of our cooperation with Armenia. We have cooperation in the field of political support, diplomacy, culture. Our culture minister recently was in town. The economy, but also defense. It's a way for us to draw the conclusions from the current situation of Armenia. And to show support in a field we believe is very much needed. And you're right, defense cooperation is not only about equipment. And I would even tend to say that defense doctrine, training, the way you approach the battlefield, modernization of the armed forces are probably in the midterm even more important than equipment.
We're in agreement on that. Tell us what hindrances or obstacles have you faced? I mean, this is obviously something that's been in the works for some time. It couldn't have just shown up so quickly. This is years worth of work. What are some of the hindrances, or let's say other countries' opposition to this expansion of cooperation?
Well, it was on the top of our priority list, clearly, and of my mandate as an ambassador here. I think the defense minister, Mr. Papikian, is the single minister with whom I've had most meetings since I took the position here. The defense cooperation is a sovereign decision. So we decided this sovereign in a sovereign way, just as Armenia, in choosing to cooperate with us in that field, exerted its sovereign prerogatives. But in a way, it's also interesting because it breaks a taboo. We are the first NATO country to have an open and confident cooperation in the field of defense with Armenia, and that's a signal to the regional environment, of course, but it's also a signal to our NATO partners, and we're actually proud of it.
So, given this watershed moment, I have to ask, Armenians have a very long memory, and my family itself was from Mandat Français in Syria, and we do have we know the important role that France played during the genocide, except it did feel like it was transient, right? Is that in the end France left, it left the refugees, and it left the remnants of Armenia to the whims of the Turkish Republic. Would you say that this is the groundwork for long-term cooperation, or would this be a temporary gain, in your opinion, even if it's useful for both sides for now?
We wouldn't invest in cooperation and training, in cooperation in the between military academies if we didn't have a long-term perspective. On the other hand, Armenia's defense partnership cannot rely only on France. We are a partner. We are, I think, a credible partner. We are the first partner among NATO countries for Armenia, but there are other partners in the field of defense, and the Armenian government is actively pursuing the diversification of their partnership, and we support that.
We're noticing a lot of political support from the French side, absolutely, but we also have noticed that it's the Americans have really taken a lead when it comes to be vocally in support of Armenia, whereas France is now going to be essentially having some boots on the ground. Is this working in tandem, or are you guys pursuing any kind of separate foreign policy as your American partners?
I think if you consider the current situation, strategic situation of Armenia, there is a common understanding between France, the United States, and a large number of countries that there is concern and strong support for Armenia's territorial integrity and sovereignty. And this is a basic obligation under the UN Charter. We're not talking about preferences, we're talking about principles that we all share.
why Syunik specifically? Why is it so important? Why is it so critical now? Why all of a sudden have we stopped hearing both sides? We've started to hear more vocal and let's say strong language directed at the dictator next door. Why?
Well, take a look at the map. Syunik is and Vayot-Zor are the most narrow part of Armenia's territory, and that's the most vulnerable. And some statements, some views that were expressed in Baku have raised concerns with a number of capitals, and in particular in Paris. Our president was crystal clear about that when he intervened in the European Council a few days ago, and he made that point both including publicly to the press in Brussels. We have concerns for Armenia's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and we are very vigilant when it comes to this.
Can we say, while looking a little bit more broadly at the map, we see that France has been, for lack of a better term, dislodged from a lot of its African interests and replaced increasingly by the tandem of Russia and Turkey. Turkey not so much talked about, but they are making inroads in what was formerly French, let's say, French sphere of influence. Would planting a stake in the ground in Armenia be a way for France to counteract that, countervene that, or just kind of get back at this loss?
When it comes to the Sahel region, it's not that much Russia and Turkey that are progressing, but chaos. Basically, the number of terrorist attacks, the vulnerability of those countries, the democracy of countries like Niger, where the democratically elected president was ousted by putschists. This is what is receding, and we don't see any guarantee of stability, of security provided by Russia or whatever country that may play a subversive role in that region. It's not we don't equate the South Caucasus, Africa, the Middle East, the different environments where we are involved. And I think a good example of that, the fact that there's no replacement, there's no quid pro quo, is that we, while there's a huge and legitimate concern for the current situation in the Near East, after the terrorist assault by Hamas on Israel and the ongoing conflict that is resulting from that, we still maintain a strong focus on Armenia. We had, after this assault happened, a visit by the Defense Minister of Armenia to Paris, a visit by the Culture Minister of France to Armenia. That was in a week, in a single week. So we don't get distracted, and we don't equate different environments.
I suppose if I were to rephrase the question in a different way, what can Armenia do to become even more valuable to France and to become a host of, let's say, French bases or an outpost of French interests in a region on the peripheries of Europe?
Bases are not fashionable anymore. Yeah. And that's pretty much permanent, heavy bases abroad is pretty much a doctrine of the past. And currently, there's only one such base in Armenia, and it's not French. So no, the idea is not to replace any regional hegemon in Armenia for us. Is to help Armenia build and consolidate its sovereignty and its integrity.
Let's talk a little bit about Nagorno-Karabakh.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a distinct limitation to the wording when it comes to Karabakh itself. France and our Western partners have been unequivocal about Armenia's territorial integrity, but naturally Armenians, and I'm sure you can understand why, but many Armenians feel abandoned and disappointed about the reaction to the ethnic cleansing in Karabakh. What were France's let's say interests there, if any, to prevent this from happening or prevent it from happening again in Syunik?
Well, when it did start, and it didn't start with the Azerbaijani assault on Nagorno-Karabakh, the whole thing started with the blockers. So more than 9 months after the actual military assault. In the course of those 9 months, France seized the UN Security Council 3 times. I don't know that any country was as much active in trying to get the international community to act responsibly and react responsibly. When the offensive did happen and the mass forced exodus, because it's a forced exodus, it's not a voluntary choice, unlike some would like to portray it.
It was ethnic cleansing.
When the mass exodus happened, we were there responsive and even first respondent when it comes to the international community for humanitarian support. We tripled our humanitarian support to Armenia. We evacuated to French hospitals some very heavily wounded, including heavily burnt patients from Nagorno-Karabakh, and we sent emergency medical support. And I think in all three instances, we were the first country to react. Now, Armenia has to face the mid and long-term accommodation of the people of Nagorno-Karabakh who are forced to leave. This means challenges in terms of housing, challenges in terms of jobs, challenges in terms of education, challenges in terms of the psychosocial support that those refugees need. And on those matters, we are closely coordinating with the Armenian government, with our international partners to be supportive as well.
Some would argue that not just France, but our Western partners who, whose let's say the brand is that it's a beacon of democracy, of human rights, of individual liberties, of property rights, everything that makes Western civilization Western, and essentially the world watched as what can only be described as a fascist country, right? It's not conjecture. Azerbaijan scored 1 point higher than Taliban around Afghanistan on the Freedom Index in 2022. Ethnically cleansed, a democratic country. It was not a perfect country, but it was a democratic country. And then, of course, the domino effect comes in. What's going to happen with Taiwan? Hong Kong, we watched that as well. Is this the world that we want to live in? And what can our Western partners have done to prevent the ethnic cleansing? We're thankful for the help afterwards, but...
And no, but seizing the Security Council before it happens is not afterwards. Yeah. The thing is that France is not alone. And among your Western partners, I think we were clearly the most active, reactive, and
what about sanctioning Azerbaijan, for example?
Sanctions are decided at different levels. When it comes to European countries, they're decided at the European level. Why? Because sanctions are, in essence, of an economic nature. And we have a common market. So you cannot sanction individually as a European member state another country, a non-EU country. Why? Because if you say, okay, I will stop trade with that country, but then any other EU member state that accepts goods from that country has a free entry to your own territory. So it needs to be decided with 27 countries, or it cannot be decided. And among those 27 countries, France is not the one or among the ones reluctant to do that.
Can you tell me, Mr. Ambassador, where do you foresee the future of Armenian-French cooperation? Economically is of interest to me. The military stuff I'm excited about. Economically, how can we expand cooperation? And in what particular sectors is exciting for France? And I will point out one thing that a lot of Armenians are not noticing, is that TotalEnergies operates in Azerbaijan, right? It co-owns a gas field. So how can we make ourselves more important for France?
I think the basis, the core, the matrix of our relationship with Armenia is of a humanitarian and compassionate nature. This has very legitimate reasons, the memory of the genocide. Also the fact that the relationship for many French people, many French cities, many French NGOs with the Republic of Armenia started with the earthquake in Spitak in 1988. This is legitimate, but this is clearly insufficient given the current strategic situation of Armenia. And we should move to a more strategic relationship that applies, of course, to defense cooperation, but it also applies to the economy. We need to be supportive of the sectors and the regions that are the most vital or the most exposed. On the other hand, this requires a good investment climate in Armenia. And this requires a good feedback from French companies who are currently involved in the Armenian market. The withdrawal from Armenia of Orange Telecom did hurt a lot the perception of the Armenian market, and this should not be repeated.
Tell us, this is a recent talking point, but we might as well cover it. As of last week, it seems that Armenia has, let's say through the mouth of our Prime Minister, pretty much openly declared that our new foreign policy vector will be the closest possible integration with the European Union. We've stopped short of mentioning any kind of candidacy status, but what would France's role be in potentially extending a hand to Armenia to join the European family, where a lot would argue it belongs?
Well, we already have. There's an initiative that was launched by President Emmanuel Macron of a European political community, which allows on matters of European interest. And you're right, Europe is not only the EU. Europe is wider than EU. Europe includes, even after Brexit, the UK. Europe includes Ukraine. Europe includes Armenia. And in that format that was created based on this initiative by President Macron, Armenia was included and is included, and we made sure that Armenia would be part of it. And it's also been one of the forums where the conflict with Azerbaijan and the possible resolution of that conflict is being discussed. So I think Armenia is already benefiting from that, and that's clearly for us a way to show that we believe that Armenia is a member of the European family, in particular while it's pursuing a more democratic, sovereign path as it has been for the past few years.
We mentioned democracy quite a bit in our discussion. I think it is important to point out what our neighbors are looking like right now. And I think that there is quite a bit of disappointment that, at least in comparison between Ukraine and Russia, where you have an oil-rich, behemoth authoritarian regime attacking an imperfect democracy, but one that's striving to be a democracy. We have an exact replica of the situation. We're not seeing enough from the European side to condemn Azerbaijan, or at least to hold them to account in their behavior with Armenia. So this ties into the idea of peace. We're hearing a lot about it, we're talking a lot about it, and I'm certain everyone would like peace. Everyone is tired of sending their sons to be obliterated by drones. We get it. But we don't trust that peace is going to solve anything, because the country next to us has a vested interest in keeping us as an enemy. Is Europe aware of this? Is Europe naive to this fact? We find it a little bit concerning that Mr. Pashinyan and Mr. Aliyev are greeted kind of as a similar standing.
I'm not representing Europe.
I'm aware.
I'm representing the French Republic.
France specifically, yes.
And I don't think that Mr. Pashinyan has been greeted inappropriately when it comes to his dealings with the French authorities and in particular with our president, who is in very regular contact with him. So. Question maybe for some European officials.
And that's a fair point. So more specifically then, how actively is France pursuing the conclusion of a peace treaty, and what guarantees would France like to see to ensure that this is something that is genuine and it's worth the ink that it's written in?
Well, clearly there's no peace treaty without clear recognitions of borders. And that's one of the key points when it comes to the possibility, the risk of further aggression or ulterior motives. It's not the only component, but it's a key component.
Is France offering any kind of guarantee to ensure that aggression does cease in that moment?
Well, any country who's a member of the UN is committed to the UN Charter, and thus the sovereignty and integrity of members. What we do, beyond principles, is that we initiate cooperations that consolidate Armenia's capability to defend itself.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
To have you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks again. It's been Patrick. Thanks for joining us on CivilNet.